Everyone in my family keeps begging me to forgive my sister-in-law for the cruel thing she said about my dead daughter, but nobody knows what she actually whispered to my wife at the funeral. The water in the pool was still moving when Priscilla said it. My wife's phone was at the bottom of the deep end, screen cracked against the drain grate, and Elena was on her knees at the edge trying to decide if she should go in after it. I had just pulled our son Theo out of the shallow end because my nephew Wes had shoved him under twice, laughing both times. I was calm. I was being calm on purpose, the way you learn to be calm when your 6-year-old daughter has been dead for 6 weeks and you're standing in your brother's backyard pretending this is a normal Saturday. Actions have consequences, Elena said, quiet, not even looking up from the water. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to Mason, my other nephew, who'd thrown her bag in after the phone. Priscilla came off the patio like she'd been loaded into a slingshot. "You don't get to discipline my kids," she said. Her voice carried over the fence. 2 of the neighbors' heads turned. "Nobody's disciplining anyone," I said. "She's talking about a phone, Priscilla." That's when she looked at Elena, and something in her face changed, went flat and mean in a way I'd seen before, but never aimed directly at my wife like a weapon. "Maybe if you understood consequences," Priscilla said, "your daughter would still be alive." The backyard went silent enough that I heard the pool filter cycle. Elena's knees just stopped working. She went down onto the concrete, not dramatic, not a performance, just down, like the string holding her up had been cut. My mother caught her under the arms before her head hit the edge. Grant grabbed Priscilla by the elbow and hauled her toward the sliding door, saying her name over and over like a man trying to wake someone from a nightmare. I didn't say anything. I picked Theo up, even though he's 9 and too big to carry, and I found Elena's shoes and my own, and I walked my family to the car. Nobody stopped us. Nobody said a word as we backed down the driveway. I remember looking in the rearview mirror and seeing my mother still crouched by the pool and Grant's silhouette in the kitchen window, and no sign of Priscilla at all, like she'd already gone somewhere she couldn't be reached. Nobody called that night. Not Grant, not my mother, not Priscilla with some hollow apology sent through a text she didn't have the nerve to say out loud. The drive home was silent except for Theo asking twice why Aunt Elena fell down, and me telling him she just felt dizzy, a lie I hated telling him even as it left my mouth. Elena didn't speak until we were in our own driveway, and then she said only, "I need to lie down," and went straight to bed with her shoes still on. I sat on the edge of the tub in our bathroom for a long time afterward, not crying, just staring at the tile, trying to understand how a woman who had held my hand at Sadie's hospital bedside just 6 weeks earlier had turned around and used my daughter's death as a weapon against my wife in front of half our family. I want to explain what led to that moment because on its own it sounds like a woman having a bad day. It wasn't a bad day. It was the end of something that had been rotting for a long time, and I didn't see the rot until it was already through the floor. Elena and I met at a community college registration line 13 years ago. Both of us signed up for the same overcrowded biology elective, and I asked to borrow a pen and never gave it back on purpose so I'd have a reason to talk to her again. We got married 2 years later at the county courthouse and threw a small backyard reception at my parents' house because neither of us had the money for anything bigger. Grant was my best man. He gave a toast that started strong and fell apart into tears by the second sentence, and everyone laughed and clapped, and I remember thinking that was the kind of brother I had, the kind who couldn't get through a happy sentence about me without his voice breaking. I hold on to that memory harder now than I used to, because it's proof that whatever happened later, something real used to exist between us, something worth grieving on its own. My name doesn't matter much to this story, so I'll leave it out the way I've left it out everywhere else online. What matters is that I'm 34. I've been married to Elena for 11 years, and until March we had 2 kids. Theo is 9, Sadie was 6. She died on a Tuesday in March, 31 hours after we brought her to Millbrook Children's with a fever that wouldn't break and a headache she described in her exact words as a marching band in my head. Bacterial meningitis. The doctor who told us used the phrase, "nothing anyone could have done," 4 separate times in a 10-minute conversation, like he already knew we'd need to hear it that many times to start believing it. We didn't, not really. Grief doesn't listen to doctors. Grant is my older brother by 2 years. Growing up, he was the one who taught me to drive stick in the church parking lot, who covered for me the summer I wrecked our dad's truck, who stood up at my wedding and cried through the whole toast, even though he'd told me beforehand he wasn't the crying type. Grant married Priscilla 9 years ago. I liked her fine at the wedding. I liked her fine for the first few years. She was sharp, funny in a cutting way, the kind of person who could make a room laugh at someone's expense and somehow make the someone laugh too. It took me longer than it should have to notice that the jokes always seemed to land on Elena. It started small enough that we told each other we were imagining it. A comment at Thanksgiving 3 years ago about how Theo's reading scores were a little unnatural for a kid that age, don't you think? Said with a smile, like a compliment with the pin still in it. A comment about how Elena must have a lot of free time to bake for the church fundraiser, when Elena worked 4 10-hour shifts a week at the hospital lab and baked at 11 at night because it helped her sleep. Small things. The kind of things you let go because calling them out feels like escalating a fight nobody else can see is happening. I've had to sit with my own part in this too, uncomfortable as that is to admit on camera. I was the one who kept telling Elena she was overreacting. I was the one who laughed along at some of Priscilla's earlier jokes because it was easier than being the guy who couldn't take a joke at Thanksgiving. Every small cruelty Priscilla aimed at my wife over the years landed easier because I'd trained myself, without meaning to see them as harmless. I didn't build the pattern, but I let it keep going longer than I should have, and Elena carried the weight of my blind spot right alongside everything else. I don't say that to excuse anything Priscilla did later. I say it because this story doesn't work if I pretend I was only ever the wronged party standing on the sidelines. I had a part in the years before the pool party too, a quieter one, but a real one. The specific incident I think about now, the one that reads different in hindsight, happened 2 Thanksgivings ago at my parents' house on Delford Street. Sadie was 4. She'd had a meltdown at the table, overtired, overstimulated, and Elena took her upstairs to calm down instead of forcing her to sit through dessert. Priscilla waited until Elena was back downstairs and said, loud enough for half the table to hear, "Some kids just need a firmer hand. I'd never let mine run the house like that." My mother laughed it off. Grant didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't worth a fight over pie. I brought it up to Grant once, maybe a year later, over beers on his porch. I told him it felt like Priscilla had a specific grudge against Elena, something personal, not just general crankiness. Grant got defensive fast, said Priscilla had been under a lot of pressure, 2 pregnancies in 3 years, Mason's speech delay, money stress after Priscilla left her job at the dental office. "She's not a bad person," he said. "She's just stretched thin." I let it go because he was my brother and because honestly I wanted to believe him. Believing him was easier than looking straight at what I was starting to suspect, which was that Priscilla resented Elena for reasons that had nothing to do with stress and everything to do with something older and uglier that I couldn't name yet. There was another incident, smaller, that I only understood the shape of much later. At Wes's baby shower 5 years ago, Elena was 7 months pregnant with Theo herself, swollen ankles, exhausted, and she made the mistake of sitting in the good armchair in Priscilla's living room without asking first. Priscilla made a joke in front of 15 women about how some people just make themselves comfortable wherever they land, and everyone laughed the way people laugh at a joke that isn't quite a joke, and Elena moved to a folding chair by the wall for the rest of the party without a word. She told me about it in the car afterward, more confused than hurt, the way you are when you can't yet tell if you imagine something or not. I told her she was probably reading too much into it. I want to be honest that I said that. I want to be honest that I was wrong. Elena and Priscilla had been close once, or close enough. In the first 2 years after Grant and Priscilla got married, the 4 of us used to do a standing Friday dinner, rotating houses, and Elena and Priscilla would stay up after Grant and I went to bed, talking in the kitchen about nothing, the way sisters-in-law who are actually becoming friends do. Elena told me once that she thought Priscilla was the funniest person she'd ever met, before the funny started curdling into something with teeth. Something shifted around the time Elena got pregnant with Theo, and neither of us could ever point to the exact day it happened. We just noticed, eventually, that the kitchen conversations had stopped, and the jokes had started landing somewhere that left a mark. When Sadie died, Priscilla showed up at the hospital within an hour. She hugged me hard, cried real tears, told Elena she was so sorry, over and over. For a while, I thought maybe I'd misjudged her all those years. Grief does that. It makes you want to believe the worst version of a person was just a phase, that tragedy resets everyone to their better selves. I wanted that so badly, I ignored the fact that Priscilla's hug with Elena lasted exactly as long as it took for someone to raise a phone camera, and not 1 second longer. Sadie was the kind of kid who narrated her own life out loud constantly, whether anyone was listening or not. She named her stuffed rabbit Countess Fluff and insisted on the full title every time, correcting anyone who shortened it. She wanted to be a marine biologist and then, 3 weeks later, a school bus driver, and she saw no contradiction in changing her mind that fast. The Tuesday she got sick, she'd complained the fever felt like a marching band in my head, and Elena had laughed despite herself because it was such a Sadie thing to say, even while she was miserable. By that evening, the fever hit 104 and wouldn't move. We were at Millbrook Children's by 9. She was gone by 4 the next afternoon. 31 hours, start to finish. The doctor used the phrase, "nothing anyone could have done," 4 times in one conversation, like he already knew we'd need to hear it that many times before any part of it would start to sink in. It never fully did. Grief doesn't take instructions from doctors, no matter how many times they repeat themselves. The funeral was on a Saturday in late March, at Hargrove Funeral Home on Route 9, the same place we'd buried my grandfather 6 years earlier. It cost $14,200, a number I remember because Elena and I sat at the kitchen table 2 days later doing math we shouldn't have had to do, trying to figure out which credit card had room left on it, whether the small life insurance policy through my job at the warehouse would clear in time to cover the difference. 200 people came. Sadie's kindergarten class sent a card the size of a poster board, every kid's name signed in crayon, a few of them still working on their letters. I don't remember most of that day. Grief works like that. It takes the day and leaves you holes where the memories should be. But I remember Elena disappearing for almost 20 minutes during the reception, and I remember her coming back gray in the face, and I remember asking her what was wrong and her saying, "Nothing, I just needed air," in a voice that told me it was very much not nothing. I didn't push. We were both barely functioning. I filed it away the way you file away 100 small wrong things in the middle of the worst week of your life, telling yourself you'll deal with it later, when later feels survivable. That's the piece that connects to the pool party. That's the thing Priscilla thought she'd buried. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. For the first week after the pool party, nobody in my family called. I think even Priscilla understood on some level that there was no version of a phone call that would help. We spent that week the way we'd spent most weeks since March, moving through the house like ghosts, trying not to bump into each other's grief. Elena barely spoke. I went back to work at the warehouse because staying home made the silence worse, not better. The calls started on day 8, my mother first. Carol has always been the family's designated peacemaker, the one who shows up at every falling out with a casserole and a speech about how family is all we really have. I understand why she's like that. Her own mother and her sister didn't speak for the last 11 years of her mother's life over a property dispute, and Carol has spent 40 years terrified of watching that happen again in her own family. But understanding where someone's fear comes from doesn't make it less exhausting when they aim it at you during the worst year of your life. Priscilla's a wreck, my mother said. She hasn't left the house. Grant says she cries every night. She's postpartum still, you know? Even with Wes being 3 now, some women just don't bounce back the way you'd think. She said Sadie would still be alive if Elena had been watching her better, I said, in front of 12 people. I know, honey. I know what she said, but she wasn't in her right mind. None of us have been in our right minds since March. She said this like it was an argument, like the fact that all of us were shattered somehow made it reasonable for Priscilla to have aimed her shrapnel directly at Elena's chest. This is the first move people make when they want you to fold. They widen the frame until the specific cruelty gets lost inside the general tragedy. I told my mother I needed to go, and I hung up before she could finish her sentence about family being all we really have. Grant texted 2 days later. Longer message, clearly drafted more than once. You could feel the effort in the punctuation. He said Priscilla wanted to apologize in person. He said she'd been diagnosed with postpartum depression a year ago, and it had flared back up under the stress of watching our family suffer. He said, and this line stuck with me, I know what she said was unforgivable, but I'm asking you to forgive her anyway, for me. That's the second move. Weaponizing the relationship you actually value to extract forgiveness for someone you don't. Grant knew I would do almost anything for him. He was betting that almost had more give in it than it did. I wrote back that I needed time, and that Elena wasn't ready to see Priscilla, maybe not ever. He said he understood. I don't think he did. Not yet. A few days after that, Grant asked if we'd still come to Mason's 7th birthday party, already scheduled for early June, already paid for at a trampoline park 30 minutes out of town. He said Priscilla would keep her distance if we came, framing her restraint like a gift she was offering, rather than the bare minimum anyone should expect after what she'd said. I told him I'd think about it. Elena and I talked about it for 2 nights before deciding we'd go, mostly for Theo's sake, since he and Mason were close despite everything happening above their heads. Priscilla did keep her distance, technically, staying on the opposite side of the trampoline park for most of the party, but she made a point of catching my eye twice across the room, a small, tight smile each time, like she was checking whether the ice had thawed at all. It hadn't. I didn't smile back either time, and by the second hour she stopped trying. The third move came from my Aunt Denise, who I hadn't spoken to outside of Christmas cards in maybe 4 years, suddenly texting to say she'd heard there was some tension and hoped everyone could find their way back to each other soon, especially with everything else going on. Then a cousin, Ray, who I hadn't seen since a wedding 2 summers back, sent a message that read like it had been copied from somewhere, all about how life was too short for grudges and how Sadie would want us all together. I stared at that one for a long time. Using my daughter's name to argue for Priscilla's comfort was a new low, and it told me something about how far the story had already drifted from what actually happened by the time it reached the edges of the family. Then a family group chat I'd muted in April lit up with a photo of Priscilla holding baby Wes at his dedication 2 years earlier, captioned by somebody I never found out who. Remember when things were good. Nobody in that group chat had been at the pool party. Nobody had heard the actual words. They were reacting to a rumor of a fight, softened by 2 rounds of retelling, and somehow I was the one being asked to manage their discomfort. I didn't respond to any of it. Elena, when I told her what was happening, just shook her head and said, they didn't hear it. If they'd heard it, they wouldn't be asking this. She was right. And it was the loneliest kind of right. The kind where being correct doesn't fix anything. It just tells you exactly how alone you are inside your own family. The next escalation wasn't a message at all. It was Priscilla showing up at Theo's Saturday baseball game at the Millbrook rec fields, 10 days after the pool party, sitting 3 rows behind us in the bleachers like nothing had happened. I don't think it was an accident. Mason plays in the same league, different team, different game time, and there was no reason for her to be at Theo's field that morning, unless she wanted to be seen being normal, wanted witnesses to report back that she was handling all of this with grace while I was the one holding a grudge. She didn't approach us. She just sat there in sunglasses, present, visible, letting her presence do the arguing arguing for her. Elena noticed her within the first inning and didn't say a word, just got very quiet and very still, the way she does when she's working hard not to fall apart in public. We left after the third inning, telling Theo we had somewhere to be. He was disappointed. He asked why, and I didn't have an answer that a 9-year-old should have to carry, so I told him we'd catch the next game instead. Around the same time, Priscilla tried a different angle, going around me entirely to reach Elena through a mutual friend named Karen, someone Elena had known since high school long before any of us were married into this family. Karen called Elena directly, said Priscilla had confided in her how devastated she was, how she just wanted one conversation, woman to woman, and asked if Elena would consider it, for the sake of the kids, for the sake of the family. Elena listened to the entire message and then called Karen back and asked her a single question. Did Priscilla tell you what she actually said at the funeral, word for word, or just that she said something she regrets? Karen admitted she didn't know the exact words. Elena told her that until she did, she had no business acting as a messenger for a woman asking to be forgiven for something Karen herself couldn't even describe. Karen didn't call again after that. My own mother-in-law, Elena's mother Beth, found out around this same time and reacted the way I probably should have expected, with a kind of controlled fury that surprised even Elena. Beth had never liked Priscilla much to begin with, always thought her jokes ran a little too close to cruelty, even in the early years, and when Elena finally told her what had actually happened at the funeral, Beth said only, "I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'd be worried about you if you did." It was the first time in months anyone outside our house had said something to Elena that didn't come wrapped in a request for her patience. Then came the dinner. My mother organized it under the name of an ordinary Sunday family meal. No mention of Priscilla, no mention of any of it, and Elena and I only found out it was an ambush when we walked in and saw Priscilla already seated at the table between my father and Aunt Denise, dressed carefully, hair done, like she'd prepared for a job interview. My mother's plan, I understood later, was that if enough people who loved both of us were sitting around one table, some current of ordinary family gravity would pull the whole thing back into alignment, the way it probably had for smaller disagreements in the past. This wasn't a smaller disagreement. I told my mother, quietly in the kitchen, that we were leaving, and that ambushing us into a room with the woman who'd said what she said about our dead daughter was not going to produce whatever outcome she was hoping for. She said she just wanted everyone to heal together. I told her healing wasn't something you could stage. We left before the food was served. Theo asked again why we kept leaving places early. I didn't have a better answer that time either. The fourth move was the one that actually cracked something open, though not in the way Grant intended. He called me instead of texting, which he almost never does, and he sounded tired in a way that was different from the earlier messages, less rehearsed. He asked if he could bring Priscilla over. Not to force anything, he said, just to let her say her piece to me, one time, with him there. He said Elena didn't have to be present. He said if I still wanted nothing to do with Priscilla after that, he'd never bring it up again. I thought about it for 2 days. Part of me wanted to refuse outright, but another part of me, the part that still loved my brother more than I was angry at his wife, thought maybe hearing her say it to my face badly, with Grant as a witness, would at least put a period at the end of the sentence. I told him yes. Tuesday, 7 o'clock, Elena would be at her mother's with the kids. In between all of this, a smaller thing happened that I didn't think mattered at the time. Elena's phone, the one that shattered in Grant's pool, had been sitting in a drawer since the party, screen spider-webbed, unresponsive. I finally took it to a data recovery place on Route 40 called Ferris Tech, mostly because Elena wanted the photos of Sadie off it before we gave up on the device entirely. The guy at the counter, a heavy-set man named Owen who talked more than the job required, said it would take about 10 days to pull what was salvageable off the internal storage, longer if the water damage had reached the board. I paid the $60 deposit and forgot about it. I had no idea what else was going to come off that phone besides pictures of my daughter. I didn't have to wait until Tuesday to learn something else, though. 4 days before Grant and Priscilla were due to come over, Owen from Ferris Tech called to say Elena's phone data was ready for pickup. I want to be honest about something before I go further. I thought hearing Priscilla's rehearsed apology would be the hardest part of that week. I was wrong, and what came next changed the story from being about one cruel woman into being about how far a family will bend to protect the shape of itself, even when the shape is rotten in the middle. Owen handed me a small hard drive with everything Ferris Tech had recovered off Elena's shattered phone. Most of it was exactly what we expected. 3 years of photos, hundreds of them of Sadie, birthday parties, a video of her singing along to a cartoon off-key, footage from Christmas of her opening a stuffed rabbit she'd named Countess Fluff and never once called anything else. Elena cried for an hour going through those. I did too. But buried in the recovered data was something neither of us expected. A cloud backup of old text threads that had synced to the phone months before it broke. Threads Elena hadn't looked at in years, going back to a group chat titled simply Girls that included Elena, Priscilla, and my mother, dated all the way back to the week of the funeral. I almost didn't read it. It felt like trespassing on Elena's phone, even though it was technically our shared account. But Elena handed it to me herself, said her hands were shaking too hard to hold the tablet steady, and asked me to read it out loud. The relevant messages started started 2 days after the funeral. Priscilla had written to my mother, not to Elena, a long message that began, "I need to tell you something and I need you to not repeat it." She went on to describe, in her own words, what she'd said to Elena in the hallway near the bathroom. She didn't deny it. She wrote it out almost proudly, framing it as something Elena had needed to hear. Said Elena had been checked out as a mother for years, and that someone had to be honest with her eventually, funeral or not. She wrote that she didn't regret it, only that she regretted saying it somewhere Elena's collapse might have drawn attention. My mother's reply came 4 minutes later. 4 words. "Don't tell your brother-in-law." Not a rebuke, not shock, a request for containment. 2 days after that, another message from my mother. "He's got enough on his plate. This stays between us." Priscilla had replied with a single word. "Agreed." I scrolled further, hands cold, Elena watching my face instead of the screen because she said she couldn't look at it a second time. There were more messages through April, most of them my mother checking in on Priscilla directly, asking how she was holding up, never once asking how Elena was holding up in the same thread, as if the two of them had quietly agreed that Priscilla was the one who needed protecting from the fallout of her own words. One message from my mother in early May read, "I think he's starting to soften. Give it time." Another, later that same week, "Don't push the apology yet. Let him come to it." My mother had been coaching the timeline of Priscilla's apology for weeks before Grant ever called me about it, managing the rollout the way you'd manage a product launch, and every phone call I'd gotten from her in that window, every "she's struggling," every "give her grace," had been delivered by someone who already knew, in exact words, what grace she was asking me to extend. I sat with that for a long time before I said anything more to Elena. It wasn't just that Priscilla had said something monstrous at my daughter's funeral, it was that my mother had known in detail within 48 hours and had spent the following months calling me to ask why I couldn't find a way to forgive Priscilla for something my mother had helped bury. Every phone call about hormones and postpartum stress and family being all we really have had been made by a woman who already knew exactly what those hormones had produced, in Priscilla's own written words, and had chosen protection over honesty. The planted detail I hadn't thought twice about, a shattered phone in a kitchen drawer, had turned into the one piece of evidence that made the whole ordeal make sense. It wasn't just Priscilla's cruelty I was up against. It was a structure built to keep that cruelty invisible, and my mother had been one of the load-bearing walls. I didn't call anyone that night. I sat with Elena on the back porch until almost 1 in the morning, not talking much, just present with each other in the specific quiet that comes after a second gut punch on top of a first one that never really healed. Elena said something I've thought about since. She said, "I think I always knew Priscilla was capable of it. I never thought your mother would help her hide it. That was the part that hurt worse in the end. You brace yourself for cruelty from people you already suspect. You don't brace yourself for betrayal from the people who raised you." She asked me later that night, lying in the dark with neither of us close to sleep, whether I thought this changed what I owed my mother going forward. I told her I didn't know yet, that I needed to hear my mother say something true before I could answer that. Elena said she wasn't asking me to cut anyone off on her behalf, that this wasn't her fight to referee, but that she needed me to stop being the one who smoothed things over every time my family made her feel like an inconvenience to their comfort. I told her I understood, and for once I meant it in a way that was going to actually change what I did next, not just how I felt about it. The Tuesday of Grant and Priscilla's visit arrived cold for June, one of those nights where the air feels like it's holding its breath. I let them in. Priscilla sat on the far end of our couch, hands folded in her lap like a kid called to the principal's office, and Grant sat beside her, close enough to touch but not touching. I stayed standing. Priscilla had clearly rehearsed. I could hear the shape of it, the pauses in the places pauses go in a speech you've practiced in a mirror. She talked about postpartum depression, about the stress of Mason's speech therapy costing $400 a month out of pocket, about watching our family in pain and not knowing how to help. So instead, she'd lashed out at the person closest to her. She said she loved Sadie. She said she'd give anything to take the words back. She asked finally if there was any way, over time, that we could find our way back to being a family. I let her finish every word. Then I looked at Grant. "Do you remember the night we found out Sadie didn't make it?" I asked him. "In the hallway outside the ICU. You held on to me and you said, 'Whatever you need, I'm here. I don't care what it costs me. You're my brother.' Do you remember saying that?" His eyes were already wet. "Of course I remember." "Did you mean it?" "You know I meant it." I looked back at Priscilla. "I'm never going to forgive you," I said. "Not today. Not next year. Not ever. Sadie's name doesn't come out of your mouth again. Not to me, not to Elena, not at any family gathering for the rest of your life. And if I ever find out you've spoken her name to anyone in this family behind my back, I will tell every person in this family exactly what you whispered to my wife at the funeral." The room changed temperature. Priscilla's face went through 3 or 4 expressions fast, landing on something between fear and fury. "What is he talking about?" Grant said, turning to her. "What did you say at the funeral? Priscilla, what did you say?" She shook her head. "I don't know what he's talking about." I could have stopped there. Elena had asked me, weeks earlier, not to say anything, not to start a war while we were both barely upright. I'd honored that for exactly as long as I could, right up until Priscilla brought her cruelty into my brother's brother's living room and dressed it up as an apology. Some promises get overridden by other promises. I'd made one to Elena in a hallway of grief. I'd made another to myself the day of that pool party, that I would never again let this woman perform sorrow for an audience, while the people she'd actually hurt sat in silence protecting her. She pulled Elena aside at the reception, I said, near the bathroom hallway, while our daughter was lying in a casket 20 feet away, and she leaned in close and she whispered, "Maybe if you'd been watching her better, she'd still be alive." Grant didn't move for a long moment. Then his mouth opened and nothing came out. He turned to look at his wife the way you look at someone you've just realized you never actually knew. "That's not," Priscilla started and stopped, because there was no ending to that sentence that wasn't a confession. "Is it true?" Grant said. Not a question, really. A demand dressed as one. "I was grieving too," she said, voice cracking now, the rehearsed calm gone completely. "I loved Sadie. I would never... The hormones, I wasn't myself. I've told you that. I've told everyone that. You told Carol," I said, 2 days after the funeral. "I have the message. You told her exactly what you said, word for word, and you told her you didn't regret saying it, only that you regretted where you said it." Priscilla's face drained of whatever color it had left. "You went through my messages?" "They were on Elena's phone," I said. "The one your sons broke at the pool party. Funny how that worked out." "That's not fair," she said, and even as the words left her mouth, she seemed to hear how absurd they sounded. Fairness, invoked by the one person in the room who had actually been unfair, and she didn't finish the thought. Grant wasn't listening anymore. I watched something in him give way, physically, his shoulders dropping like a structure losing its load-bearing wall. He sat down hard on the arm of the couch and put his face in his hands. I told them both it was time to go. My voice came out flatter than I expected, almost gentle, the way you talk when you're too exhausted to be angry anymore. Grant stood without a word and walked to the door like he was pushing through water. Priscilla reached for his hand in the driveway. He pulled his arm away from her, said something too quiet for me to hear, and got into the driver's seat without waiting for her. I watched from the porch as she stood by the passenger door for a second too long before finally getting in. I called my mother 2 mornings later. I read her own words back to her, the ones from the group chat, slowly, so there could be no confusion about what I was referencing. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I asked if she was still there. "I didn't want to add more pain to what you were already carrying," she finally said. "I thought I was protecting you." "You were protecting her," I said. "There's a difference, and I think you know it." She didn't argue. That was almost worse than if she had. An argument would have meant she still believed her own reasoning. The silence meant some part of her already knew it hadn't held up, and had known for months, and had made calls to me anyway, asking me to forgive a woman my mother had personally helped shield from consequences. "I love you," she said before I hung up. "I know that doesn't fix it." "It doesn't," I said, "but I heard you say it." I told her I needed space from her too, not forever, but for a while, in a way I couldn't yet define. She cried. I didn't feel good about that, but I didn't feel like taking it back either. Grant went quiet after the confrontation at my house. 2 days of nothing. Elena told me to check on him, not about Priscilla, just to make sure he was okay, because whatever had happened to his marriage, he was still my brother, and he'd looked like a building coming down when he walked out my door. I sent him one line. "Need anything?" 3 hours later, 2 words came back. "I need time." I gave it to him. 4 days after that, a car I didn't recognize sat outside our house with its lights off for almost 10 minutes before pulling away. I told myself it was probably nothing, a neighbor's guest, someone lost looking for an address. The next morning, an envelope was taped to our front door, no name on the front, and I recognized Grant's handwriting from 30 years of birthday cards the second I saw it. Inside was a single folded page. He'd written that he was filing for separation, not divorce yet, but separation, and that he needed me to know it wasn't only because of what I'd said on my couch. He wrote that once he started asking Priscilla direct questions, other things had come apart fast. An unpaid credit card balance she'd hidden from him worth almost $9,000, a pattern of comments to his own co-workers' wives that he'd dismissed as jokes for years the same way I once had, and a conversation with his own sister-in-law, Priscilla's younger sister Renata, who told him she'd watched Priscilla behave this way toward people she saw as competition for years, going back to before she and Grant were even married. He wrote that he was staying at a Comfort Inn off Route 9 for the time being. He wrote that he loved me, and he was sorry it had taken him this long to see what had been sitting in his own house. I didn't expect Renata to become an ally in any of this. I'd met her maybe 6 times in 9 years, mostly at holidays, always polite but distant. She called me herself about a week later, said she'd heard fragments of what happened from Grant, and wanted to tell me directly that she believed every word of it. She told me about a comment Priscilla had made to her at her own baby shower years earlier, cruel, precise, aimed at a miscarriage Renata had never told most of the family about. "She's always known exactly where to aim," Renata said. "I should have warned Elena a long time ago. I didn't because I didn't want the family to turn on me instead of her. I'm sorry. That's on me." The handoffs themselves became a small logistical war of their own for a while. Grant and Priscilla couldn't stand to be in the same driveway for the first month after the separation, so custody exchanges happened in the parking lot of a Kroger on Route 9, neutral ground, 5 minutes each way, timed almost to the second so neither of them would have to linger near the other. Grant told me once that standing in that parking lot, handing Wes's booster seat across the back of his own car felt more humiliating than anything Priscilla had ever said to him directly, a small public admission, every week, that something he'd built for 9 years had come apart. Eventually, a mediator got involved and set a proper schedule, and the Kroger parking lot handoff stopped, but I don't think Grant ever stopped associating that particular store with the worst version of that year. Renata ended up being someone I leaned on more than I expected that summer, given how little we'd known each other before any of this. She was the one who told me, gently, that Priscilla had grown up with a mother who ran the household on comparison and competition, that Priscilla had spent her whole childhood being measured against a cousin who got better grades and a sister who got more attention, and that some of what came out of her as cruelty had first gone into her as exactly that, years and years of it, absorbed and never examined. I told Renata I understood where it came from, didn't excuse where it landed. She agreed completely. Knowing why a person is broken doesn't mean you have to stand next to the pieces, she said. I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone said to me that year. Renata also became, in a strange, sideways way, someone Elena reconnected with. The two of them started getting coffee occasionally that fall, careful at first, feeling out whether the friendship could survive being adjacent to so much wreckage. It has so far. Elena told me once that talking to Renata felt like getting back a piece of what she'd thought she'd lost entirely when the Friday dinners stopped years ago, just wearing a different face. There was also Owen, of all people, the technician from Ferris Tech, who called a few weeks after handing over the recovered data just to check in, said he didn't usually do that, but something about the files had stuck with him. All those photos of a little girl who wasn't in any of the newer ones. I told him what the data had ended up revealing, more than he probably expected when he asked. He was quiet for a second, and then said, "I'm glad the phone broke then. Sounds like it needed to." It was a strange thing for a stranger to say, and it was also exactly right. The family split roughly the way you'd expect once the group chat messages became known, because eventually they did become known. I showed them to Grant, and Grant showed his father, and from there it moved through the family the way anything true or false eventually does, faster than anyone controlling it wants. My father, who has never in his life picked a side in anything, picked one this time, quietly stopped inviting Priscilla to anything he was hosting, without a word of explanation to anyone. He called me once that August, gruff as always, and said only, "Your mother was wrong on this one. I told her so." That was the whole conversation. It was more than I expected from him, and it mattered more than a longer speech would have. My mother spent a long stretch of that summer mostly alone, showing up to family things a little smaller than she used to be, and I felt something complicated watching that happen, not satisfaction, more like grief or a version of her I'd believed in longer than I probably should have. Thanksgiving came, the first one without Sadie, and the first one, in as long as I could remember, without Priscilla at the table. My mother hosted, smaller than usual, and there was a strange, heavy quiet to the whole day, the kind that comes from everyone in the room knowing exactly why the guest list had shrunk, and nobody willing to say it out loud over the turkey. Theo asked me in the car on the way home why Aunt Priscilla wasn't there anymore, and why Uncle Grant seemed sad the whole time. I told him some grown-ups say things that can't be taken back, and that sometimes love isn't enough to undo that, and he nodded like he understood more of it than I expected a 9-year-old to. Kids absorb more than we give them credit for. He hasn't asked about Priscilla since. There was one more piece of it that surprised me. In October, Priscilla sent Theo a birthday card in the mail, addressed only to him, no note to Elena or me, $20 folded inside, and a short message that read, "Thinking of you, love Aunt Priscilla." I didn't intercept it. Theo opened his own mail. I sat with him while he read it and asked if he wanted to write back. He thought about it for a while and said, no, not really. He just wanted to keep the $20. I let that be his decision to make, not mine. Though I noticed the card never mentioned Sadie at all, and I understood it for what it was. Not real repair, just Priscilla testing whether a door I'd nailed shut still had any give in it. It didn't. There was a quiet evening in July, months into all of it, when Grant came over by himself, and we sat in the backyard with 2 beers we barely drank, and he asked me if I thought their marriage could have been saved if he'd asked the right questions years earlier. Back at that Thanksgiving with the comment about Theo's reading scores, back when it was small enough to still be arguable. I told him I didn't know. I told him I'd asked myself something similar about Sadie's fever, whether getting her to the hospital 4 hours earlier would have changed anything, and that some questions don't have answers that help you. They just have answers that are true. He nodded and didn't say much after that. We sat there a long time, 2 brothers grieving 2 different losses that had somehow become tangled into the same year. At one point that evening, he asked if I hated him for staying with her as long as he had, for not seeing what I'd seen years before he did. I told him no. I told him loving someone and seeing them clearly at the same time might be the hardest thing a person is asked to do, and that I'd failed at it plenty of times myself, with my own mother, with my own blind spots about how deep this thing ran before the pool party forced it into the open. He cried a little then, quiet, no drama to it, just a grown man letting something out he'd been holding since March. I didn't say much. I just sat there with him. Some nights, that's the whole job, being the person who sits there. There were logistics that dragged the rest of that summer out longer than any of it needed to be. Grant and Priscilla's separation agreement took until October to finalize, complicated by the custody arrangement for Mason and Wes, and by the discovery of that hidden credit card debt, nearly $9,000 run up over 2 years on an account Grant hadn't known existed, spent mostly on things Priscilla never fully explained, a storage unit neither of them used anymore, clothes with tags still on them found later in a closet. Grant ended up splitting the balance despite everything, because his lawyer told him fighting it in court would cost more in fees than the debt itself, and by that point, he told me he just wanted the paperwork finished more than he wanted to be right. Priscilla moved into an apartment across town in September, a 2-bedroom on Coldwater Lane, so the boys would have their own room on the weekends they stayed with her. She still sees them every other weekend, plus Wednesdays for dinner. I've heard secondhand through Renata that she's in therapy now, real therapy, twice a week. Not the kind you mention as a defense at a rehearsed apology. I hope that's true for the boys' sake more than hers. I don't feel much when I hear it either way. Some wounds close over time, some just stop being the first thing you think about in the morning, which isn't the same thing as healing, but it's something. Mason took it hardest from what Grant tells me, old enough at 7 to understand something was permanently different, but too young to have language for what. He started asking Grant, most nights for a while, whether it was his fault, whether throwing that bag in the pool back in April had started all of it. Grant told him no, none of this was because of a phone, and spent a long stretch of the summer repeating that until Mason believed it. Wes, at 5, mostly just wanted to know why he had 2 bedrooms now instead of 1, and seemed, in the uncomplicated way of 5-year-olds, to eventually decide 2 bedrooms wasn't the worst arrangement in the world. Theo still plays with both of them when the families cross paths, and Elena and I have been careful never to let whatever happened between the adults become something the boys have to carry as their own guilt. That much at least we could control. Elena and I didn't speak to my mother for almost 5 months. We started again slowly, over the winter, small conversations, a coffee here, a short visit there. She's never fully explained herself in a way that felt like enough, and I've stopped waiting for a version of the explanation that would. What I've settled on instead is a smaller, more honest relationship with her than the one I had before, built on what she's actually shown me she's capable of rather than what I want to believe about her. It's been 10 months now since Sadie died, and almost 8 since a woman I used to call family stood in a backyard and said the cruelest sentence I've ever heard out loud, and somehow the second half of that sentence, the part almost nobody knew, turned out to matter just as much as the first. Theo started 4th grade back in the fall. He still asks about Sadie most nights, usually small questions, whether she'd have liked his new teacher, whether she's cold wherever she is. I don't always have good answers, but I've stopped pretending I do, and he seems to trust the honest version more than the comforting one anyway. Elena went back to full shifts at the lab in August, said the routine helped more than staying home ever did. We don't go to family gatherings the way we used to. The ones we do attend are smaller, quieter, missing people who used to fill up a room with noise that I once mistook for warmth. We started a small tradition in June, just the 3 of us, driving out to a lookout point near the reservoir every Sunday evening and letting Theo pick one thing to say out loud about his sister. No rules on what it has to be, funny or sad or just a fact he remembers. Some weeks he doesn't have anything, and that's fine too. It isn't therapy exactly, though our actual therapist, Dr. Yates, thinks it's doing more good than the $1,800 a month we've spent on sessions since March. I believe her. There's something about choosing your own ritual instead of having other people's expectations handed to you dressed up as tradition that makes grief feel less like something happening to you and more like something you're finally allowed to shape. Our house is quieter too, in a different way than grief alone would explain. Sadie's room is still mostly the way she left it, though Elena finally packed away the clothes she'd outgrow into a bin in the closet, not to erase her, just because looking at a size 6 t-shirt every morning had started to feel like standing on a bruise on purpose. Countess Fluff sits on Theo's bed now. He asked if he could have her, said it felt wrong for her to sit alone in an empty room, and we said yes, and something about a stuffed rabbit changing rooms felt like the first small evidence that our house was learning how to keep moving without her in it. Some nights I still catch myself listening for her, the specific sound of her narrating her way down the hallway toward our room, some observation about the moon or a dream she needed to tell someone before she forgot it. The hallway is just quiet now. I don't think that particular quiet ever fully goes away, and I've stopped expecting it to. What's changed is that I no longer have to hold that quiet next to the noise of people demanding I also make room for someone else's comfort inside it. The house grieves at its own pace now, on its own terms, without an audience keeping score of how fast we're supposed to be moving on. I think about that pool party more than I'd like to. Not the cruelty of it, though I think about that too, but the silence that followed it, the way 12 people stood there and let it happen, and then, within days, started asking me to be the one who moved past it first. I understand now that forgiveness, when it's demanded instead of earned, isn't really about healing anyone. It's about restoring comfort to the people who benefit from the peace, whether or not they've done anything to deserve it. Nobody who asked me to forgive Priscilla that summer was thinking about Elena's peace. They were thinking about their own, about Sunday dinners running smoothly again, about not having to choose a side at Christmas. I don't blame all of them equally. Some, like my father, came around the moment they understood what had actually happened. Others, like like my mother, needed the truth dragged out from under her own hands before she'd admit what she'd been protecting. I try to leave room for the difference, even on the days it's hard to. I never got the apology I actually needed, not from Priscilla, not really from my mother either. What I got instead was the truth, dragged out from behind a rehearsed speech and a cracked phone screen, and it turns out the truth did more for me than forgiveness ever could have. There's a version of this year where that phone never breaks, where Elena's bag never goes into the pool, where the data recovery place never calls, and in that version I spend the rest of my life being told by people I love that I'm the one holding up the healing, when the entire time the actual obstacle was sitting in a group chat none of us knew to look at. I try not to think too hard about how close I came to living inside that version instead of this one. I don't know if Grant and I will ever get back to exactly what we were before this. I miss that version of us more than I let myself admit most days. The brother who taught me to drive stick, who cried through his own toast at my wedding, who told me in a hospital hallway that whatever I needed, whatever it cost him, he was there. He kept that promise in the end, just not in the way either of us expected when he made it. He kept it by choosing the truth over his own marriage, which is a kind of keeping a promise that cost more than either of us knew to ask for that night in the hallway. Something real broke in this family this year, and I don't think all of it is fixable, and I've stopped pretending otherwise just to make Sunday dinners easier for people who weren't standing at that pool and weren't standing in that hallway near the bathroom 20 feet from my daughter's casket, and never had to carry what my wife carried alone for weeks because she loved this family enough to try to protect it, right up until the day I finally understood that some things aren't mine to protect anymore. If there's a thesis to all of this, it's something I wish someone had told me years ago, back at that first Thanksgiving with the comment about Theo's reading scores, back when all of it was still small enough to explain away. The people who ask you to forgive quickly are rarely the people who were hurt. Watch who's doing the asking. Watch what they stand to gain from your silence. A family that protects the person who caused the wound instead of the person carrying it isn't offering you healing. It's offering you a smaller, quieter version of the same wound, dressed up as peace. Nobody in my family knew exactly what Priscilla whispered to my wife that day, 20 feet from our daughter's casket, in a hallway near the bathroom where she thought no one important enough to matter would ever hear about it. Now they do, and I've stopped feeling guilty about the ones who wish I hadn't told them.